All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this month's live stream. Thank you for being here. Hope you're having a wonderful weekend. Hope you're looking forward. If you're celebrating Easter tomorrow, hope you're looking forward to it. Excuse me. I saw a question up here. Kenji the Striker asked, was the motivation behind the Old Testament laws regarding sexual ethics to preserve women's virginity for their future husbands for marriage? That was the reason that premarital sex for women was outlawed. It was not prohibited at all for men in the Hebrew Bible. Now, there were expectations regarding their relation, like if they had sex with someone's virgin daughter, there was an expectation that they marry them, and there even developed a tradition that that was the activation and consummation of a marriage, having sex with a virgin woman. But sex work was not outlawed as long as it wasn't associated with the cult. And yeah, women were sexual commodities, and they were expected to be in pristine condition. And so there were expectations placed on them regarding prohibiting premarital sex and things like that. But that's a great question. The fit for today is a shirt that I was, oh gosh, I can't get a hold of it. A shirt that I was recently sent. Let's see if we can do. And for the life of me, I am struggling to remember the name of the generous person who sent it to me. I will definitely make a video about it so I can give credit where credit is due and also promote this this person's work. But it depicts the Ra'em, the unicorns from the Hebrew Bible. There's a tradition within Judaism that they swam behind the ark. And so here they are tethered to the ark and depicted like the oxes that they probably were, but with that horn there. All right, let's see. Thoughts on the new Invincible episodes? I have not seen the new Invincible episodes. I've seen Ryan posting about it, but I have not seen them, so I do not have any thoughts as of yet. Ben Stillman, hey Dan, you mentioned in a recent video that a 2nd century view on the Trinity would differ greatly from a 5th century view. Could you give an idea of what Christians in both centuries might believe? In the 2nd century, there were a variety of different frameworks that they used to understand it. There, one perspective that I think we might see in like the Shepherd of Hermas is a what's called a pneumatic Christology, where God's spirit is what divinizes Jesus. And the idea might have been that Jesus was a human that was exalted. We have exaltation Christologies. We have incarnation Christologies. We have pneumatic Christology. We have angelomorphic Christologies, which is the idea that Jesus is basically occupying the role of an angel. So a lot of different Christologies. And what gets hammered out in the 4th century CE mainly sticks because it has the force of empire behind it. Prior to that, they did not have the force of empire. They were just kind of bickering. And there were consensuses, but they couldn't really shut down opposing views until finally Nicaea. And even that took a couple of centuries before everything settled. But in the 2nd and 3rd century, you had people who used the word homoousios, same substance, in reference to Jesus's relationship with God. But at the time, they had not yet decoupled the concept of ousia, of substance, from the concept of hypostasis, or person. Those were used as, if anything, they used prosopon, which meant face, which was kind of like personality. But ousia and hypostasis were considered synonymous. And so when people used homoousios, that was criticized as heretical. And I think the Montanists were the ones who were trying to get away with that. And so they had to develop certain philosophical frameworks in order to be able to deploy them in the ways that that serve their interests, which really didn't happen until the 4th and 5th centuries. Hey Dan, when does your next book come out? I'm working on getting it done right now. I've got my deadline is in a handful of weeks, and so I'm trying to get it done. The idea is that it will hit the shelves about a year from now. But that will be a trade book, and I am going to do what I can to ensure that I'm the one who gets to record the audiobook. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Okay, hey Dan, Philip asks, since religion doesn't exist outside of our discourse about it, does the cognitive science of religion ever draw upon Chomsky's universal grammar? Is that relationship between human language capacity and an understanding of religion as an innate feature of human cognition? Cognitive linguistics sometimes comes into play, but cognitive linguistics largely developed in opposition to Chomskyan generative grammar. And so it doesn't really fit well with it. However, there are a lot of folks in the cognitive science of religion who are not specialists in cognitive linguistics. And so there is some Chomskyan discussion. And so I'm trying to think of the the author of the article, and I think it was called "Has the Cognitive Science of Religion Redefined?" Let me see if religion. Let me see if I can find it. That's not it. Jurek Franek. That's right. Juraj Franek. Has the cognitive science of religion redefined religion? So let me share that real quick. And this is an example of an argument that, if I recall, it's been several years since I've been deep in this article before, but I'm almost positive that we have, there's quite a bit of discussion of Chomsky's work in here. So yeah, you do have a little of that, but what I would say is that this is not someone who's bringing in cognitive science or cognitive linguistics into the cognitive science of religion. This is someone who's reaching out from the cognitive science of religion to try to find another framework to inform their work. So I would disagree with that. And in my book, I actually discuss why I disagree with Franek. Star Wars fan says, yo. I say yo back. Hey, Dan, what are your thoughts on 2 Kings, and specifically whether the king who did evil in the sight of the Lord and the Asherah in the high places is a reference to polytheism? Any recommendations on this subject? Thank you, Wayne. My thoughts on that is that these are Deuteronomistic texts, so they are dating from periods of the reign of Josiah and after, and they are retelling the stories from before the reign of Josiah, so as to vilify what's going on there. Because between after Sennacherib came through and destroyed most of the other main cult sites except for the temple in Jerusalem, you had a concentration of all the cultic and worship attention on Jerusalem. The kings after Hezekiah probably were trying to restore what had been destroyed by Sennacherib, and Josiah comes to the throne and probably looks around and goes, you know what? I kind of like what's going on with everybody coming into Jerusalem, everybody worshiping Adonai at my cult site, everybody bringing all the offerings to Jerusalem, everybody using my priesthood. And so, lo and behold, one day Josiah happens upon the book of the law and says, hey, everybody, it turns out we were supposed to be coming only to my temple this whole time. And then they rewrite the earlier history to say they were just apostates. And that's why there were Asherim in the temple. And that's why they were worshiping in other cult sites and all that kind of stuff. That's actually one of the chapters in my book, my trade book that's forthcoming. The chapter is, does the Bible say God had a wife? And I'm going to talk about Asherah and how Josiah screwed everything up. But thank you for a great question. Star Wars fan says, Dan, there is a common claim among Christian apologists that the followers of Jesus wouldn't have let themselves been brutally murdered for their beliefs, of his miracles and divinity if they were not true? Are there any reports outside the Bible of these people being killed? Can the Bible just be taken as evidence on its own for this? No. Everything that we know about the disciples of Jesus, the apostles, and their deaths, it all comes down from tradition. We have absolutely no data that demonstrate how these people died. It's just tradition. However, it is just not true that they would have, that the only reason they would have let themselves be brutally murdered is if they knew it was true. That entirely ignores decades and decades and decades of data regarding human cognition, identity politics, and why people give up their lives for their social identities, because it happens all the time. And it's not because people know things are true, it's because they place a significant amount of value in something larger than themselves, and they see value in sacrificing themselves to that, whether it be to get greater access to power for their families, whether it is to try to strengthen social bonds within the larger group. You can look at the psychology of things like suicide terrorism to learn more about this. You can look into studies on, within the cognitive science of religion, there's lots of discussion about how people can become committed to ideologies and even sacrifice their lives for it. Folks who, the Heaven's Gate group, for instance, that they took their own lives en masse in anticipation of riding a comet to heaven that was passing by the earth. They didn't sacrifice their lives because they knew something for a fact. They did because they were dedicated to this social identity and the ideologies that were a part of it. So the people who argue that haven't done any real research in the psychology of group identity, of religion, of terrorism, of suicide terrorism, of all that kind of stuff. Okay, I have a couple questions from the chat here, some super chats. Thank you so much, Archival Blob, for the question. Why do some translations render Hosea 4:4 as people contending with a priest, and others that Adonai's contention is with the priest? Let me pull it up real quick, because it's been years since I've looked at this passage, but see what we've got in the Hebrew. So the last clause is, and with you as the contentions of the priest, or those contending with the priest. And so it looks like some people are understanding the so there's a masculine plural participle here, merive, which is based on rive, which is contention, a lawsuit, and it looks like it's in the masculine plural construct. And so it looks like that is the nomen regens, and the nomen rectum is Kohen, priest. And so it would be contenders of priest. But if you understand it as absolute, then you have to try and account for what's going on with the word Kohen. And so some people, it looks like, interpret that as evocative, O priest. And they, I see what's going on. So instead of Kim Rive, they read Kim Rivi, which would be my contention. Whereas if you read it they, then that's the masculine plural construct. And so that would be contentions or contenders of the priest. So it comes down basically to how you are vocalizing that. And let me see if that is in the Septuagint. My people. Oh, interesting. So the Septuagint doesn't have your people, it has my people. The people of me as spoken against the priest. So I think the Septuagint has probably contributed a little bit to muddying the waters there. But there, any critical commentary from the last 20 years ought to have a good discussion on that. But thanks for a great question. Shane, thank you for the question. I've heard that the further back in time we go, the more variance we find in the NT text. What evidence do we have for this, or is it false? So the closer we get to the composition of the New Testament, the fewer and fewer manuscripts we have, and the smaller and smaller they are. But if you take all of the words that we find in those manuscripts, and then you take the differences from, like a modern critical text and eclectic edition, the portion of those fragments that represents variations from the critical text represent a larger and larger portion of the total words that are attested in the manuscripts. And so, yes, in a sense, there are more variants the further back we go. And I think this is to be expected. The closer you get to the composition of the text, I think the more variation you're going to find. That's what we find with the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what we find with the Hebrew Bible, is there is consolidation and there is harmonization as the texts circulate more, because people are comparing them more. And in the second century, third century CE, you do have greater and greater concern developing for unity, where the authority is, when the New Testament is being written, the locus of authority, so the location of the authority, was not the text, it was the message. The text was just one manifestation of the message. And so the text didn't necessarily have to be identical from one to another. As long as the message got across, that was what was important. But very quickly, it shifted, and the locus of authority was the texts. And so then the text had to agree. And that's something that I think happens in 2nd, 3rd century CE, because it happens with both the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. The 2nd century is when you get the three main Septuagint recensions, where they're starting to try to harmonize the Septuagint in the direction of what we might call the Proto-Masoretic text. And so with Theodotion, Aquila, and Symmachus. And then in the New Testament, I think you see the same thing. I think the manuscripts begin to get more standardized after the 2nd century CE. Hey Dan, do you consider the Council of Jerusalem as historical? I think there could have plausibly been a Council of Jerusalem. I'm not going to say that I think what we see in Acts 15 is a verbatim account. I don't think that's entirely historical. In fact, the account of James kind of trump card at the end, which is citing a kind of testimonium that merges parts of a couple different passages from Amos. The way it is cited by James only makes sense in the context of the Jerusalem Council with the Septuagint's mistranslation. If they're going from Aramaic or Hebrew of Amos 9, I think it's 11, verses 11 and 12. If they were going directly from the Hebrew, it would have absolutely no bearing on the discussion. But the way it's cited in Acts 15, verses 16 and 17, it's citing the Septuagint's mistranslation. And the only reason it is relevant to the discussion that they're having is because of that mistranslation. And so that the way the Jerusalem Council ends couldn't happen if that discussion were taking place in Aramaic or in Hebrew. The only way that discussion could happen is if it was taking place in Greek. And I don't think many folks think that the Jerusalem Council was conducted in Greek. So I think there are reasons to doubt that that the account in Acts is historical. Matri SF, thank you so much for your question. Thanks for your work. You're very welcome. Have you read Tom Holland's Dominion, and do you have a viewpoint on his thesis that Christianity is largely responsible for our current notions of human rights, science, etc.? I've read portions of it. I haven't had time to get to the whole thing. I think his thesis is going beyond the data and is not taking seriously the scholarship on the development of Enlightenment rationalism and human rights and the Renaissance and things like that, which certainly Christianity played a role in it, but so did the recovery of classical literature. and so did deism, and so did Enlightenment rationalism. And so to say that Christian, a lot of people try to leverage Holland's work to say, see, it's all baked into Christianity from the start. And even that, like, even if you say, okay, ignore what's going on with the Enlightenment, ignore what's going on with the recovery of all this classical literature, ignore all of that, and just look at Christianity, it's like, it didn't have to happen that way. That wasn't inevitable. And that's actually not derived from the Bible. It's all historically contingent. And so I don't think the conclusion makes much sense. I think the way that apologists leverage Holland makes even less sense. And the notion that this is all, that the Bible is responsible for all of this, or that Christianity is the governing, driving force of all of this, I don't agree with at all. So, but I'm going to need to dig into Holland's book and come up with some kind of response to that. Because, yeah, I see it being quoted all over the place. Simone Yochai, thank you for the question. Question: what do you think about Summers' assertion in the Bodies book? So that would be the Bodies of God in Ancient Israel, that the Quintillet Ajrut inscription casts Asherah as a cultic object rather than an independent deity, and thus postdates the Asherah cult, properly speaking. Because ownership, his Asherah, is designated by a possessive suffix in the final hey in this case, rather than the later vav, and proper nouns don't take possessives. It makes sense, but most people take it as representing an active cult, which makes me think something is being overlooked. Is it the art? Is this a legitimate epigraphic problem? Okay, so this is another chapter. This is another part of my Did God Have a Wife chapter for my trade volume. But I'm going to point you in the direction of a paper by a friend of mine. So Quintillet Ajrut has this inscription is overlapping a drawing of male and female figures. In fact, let me show you that first. Content warning, graphic drawing coming up here. If I can find it. Quintillet, where'd you go? There we go. All right. So this is from Pithos A at Quintillet Ajrut. This is just a portion of this Pithos. There are many other drawings and even inscriptions on this Pithos. But what we see here at the very top, you see this fragmentary inscription. And the line, I wonder if you can see my, can you see? Yeah, you can see that. Okay, so that line right there on the far right begins with a lamed, La Adonai. So lamed, yod he, vav he, Shomron. So Adonai of Shomron, or Samaria, and Le Asherata, which is usually understood to mean his Asherah. This is written over top of and centered over the headdress of the male figure who has his arms interlocked with the female figure next to him. And this, I would argue, is intended, the person who wrote this is trying to represent these two figures as Adonai and Asherah by centering that inscription right above the male figure. Now, the figures are drawn in they're drawn to in ways that reflect the motifs, the symbolism of Egyptian protector deities, Bes and Beset. So male and female bovine Egyptian protector deities. However, those motifs could be overlaid on other deities as a way to try to invoke the protective powers of Bes and Beset. And so I think we have, whoever drew these two figures may not have intended for them to be Adonai and Asherah, but I would argue that whoever wrote this inscription over top, it's in different ink, it's probably a different hand, intended to identify them as Adonai and Asherah. And so a friend of mine published this paper. Ryan Thomas does phenomenal work, except when he's criticizing me, which he has a couple of times. Just kidding. Even that work is phenomenal, which is frustrating. However, he published this in Janer, the Journal of Ancient Near Eastern Religions. Going on 8 years ago. The Identity of the Standing Figures on Pithos A from Quintilla Rajrud, a reassessment. He actually asked me to do to try and do artwork for this, but I didn't get that drawing that I just showed you. That drawing I just showed you I did for my book, but I didn't have it done in time to be included in his article. But this is a 71-page article, and he goes into great detail on Bess, how Bess is represented, and how they are used to kind of nuance other deities. So if you want, I think, a phenomenal discussion that ultimately concludes that the two standing figures that are drawn on the Pithos at Quintilla Rajrud are intended to represent Adonai and Asherah. I would highly recommend this paper. And you may be able to find it on his academia.edu page. I don't know. Summers' argument is one of the two main arguments. You don't really have a firm consensus. You have half of the scholars saying no, it's probably just a cultic object that had already been subsumed into Adonai's cult. Half of the scholars say Richard Hess, surprisingly, argued that Asherah is actually the normal way that Asherah's name, the name of the goddess, was spelled in inscriptional Hebrew. So there's an argument to make that it's not a pronominal suffix, but just the way it's spelled in inscriptional Hebrew. I side with those who think it has something to do with the goddess, because even if it is just a cultic object, we have from the books of Kings, we have the indication that they had an Asherah in the temple next to Adonai that represented Asherah. And so at some point, the cultic object, the Asherah that represented Asherah, was taken over by Adonai. But we can't really make a clear and strong argument that this drawing from Quintilla Rajrud came before or after the subsuming of Asherah's role into Adonai's role and cult. And so I think I side with identifying it with the goddess, and I'm going to make that argument in that chapter of my forthcoming book. Star Wars fan, who would you consider the best apologist if you had to choose? I like, to the degree I think Richard Balcom is an apologist, I think he's probably one of the most authoritative out there. But yeah, not unproblematic, but probably the one I think that is the most success and comes up with the most thorough arguments. Quackshot, what do you think of Joel Baden's Historical David book? I think it's good. I think Joel's book is good. I think Jacob Wright's book is good. Both of them have written, I think, wonderful books on the Historical David. I would quibble with things here and there, but for the most part, I think it's really good. Okay, Fireheart, KR, thank you so much for the question. RE, all the misinformation out there, thank you for setting things straight. I appreciate that. How will it taint future interpretations in the next 2,000 years? Oh, boy. I think it will. I think as some of these claims become identity markers for social groups, they're going to dig in their heels, and these claims are going to become embedded. And it's going to be a lot harder to root them out. But 2,000 years from now, I have no idea what's going to be going on 2,000 years from now. But I think critical scholars will still be around, and we'll be banging the same drums that we've been banging for a long, long time. So who knows? Hopefully cooler heads will prevail, but don't know for sure. But thank you for the question. Fern Lovebond, thank you so much. Just bought Dr. Moss's book, God's Ghostwriters, due to her appearance on Data Over Dogma. Well, wonderful. I appreciate that. And I know that Dr. Moss appreciates that as well. Your work is amazingly helpful for me as an atheist. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the kind words. I appreciate that very much, and I'm very glad to hear that. And I hope you enjoy Candida's book. There's a lot of good insight in there. I think it overturns an awful lot. Oh gosh! And now Captain Dadpool is tagging me in posts, pictures of him with Dan Beecher, my podcast co-host. Hang on a second. So I'll just share this real quick. Attention, McClellan, I have your podcast co-host. If you ever want to record another episode of Data Over Dogma, you must make a video telling your followers that the books in the Bible were voted on at the Council of Nicaea. You have 24 hours. I think I should reply. Keep him. Okay. Now I just to not sound too mean. Whoops. Do a GIF. All right. Yeah, apparently there's an atheist convention going on right now. Evidently, they do it over Easter weekend because they figure that's when they're going to have the least amount of competition for getting venues and things like that. Daus Dava, thank you so much for the question. My strongest argument for the priestly source against my conservative father, who's a pastor, has been the book of Malachi versus Hosea. If you don't have Leanne Feldman's book, The Consuming Fire, which is an isolation and translation and a little bit of commentary on the priestly source, I think that might be helpful. But yeah, now there's a new book that so back in the mid 90s, a bunch of European scholars got together and wrote a book called A Farewell to the Yahwist? ? Well, the question mark is in the English translation. It wasn't in the German original. But and they making the argument that the J source is not a full documentary source. And now there's an edited volume being published that is called A Farewell to the Priestly Source. That's trying to do the same thing, but they're not going to have near as much success. MJR Schneider, thank you so much for the super chat question. I'm curious how Jewish aniconism fits with your concept of divine images. If idols were forbidden and the Bible mocks their worship, why would biblical authors still accept the logic of idols? I talk about that in my book, about how what they're doing is mocking certain iterations of divine images without necessarily jettisoning the underlying logic of divine images. They just reorient their understanding of how divine images work. And so it shifts from these statues to the text of the law. And you even see there is overlap in that transition, because what are Moses and Joshua commanded to do with the text of the law? Write it on standing stones. Standing stones are divine images in the ancient world. And now we suddenly have this overlap where the law is being written on the standing stones, and that's facilitating worship of Adonai. They worship Adonai before the standing stone. And then you have the practice of phylacteries, you have the practice of mezuzot and things like that. You have apotropaic amulets. In fact, the oldest manuscript of any kind of any text from the Bible comes from 600 BCE, centuries before the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's a portion of the priestly blessing from Numbers. And it's an apotropaic amulet. It is 2 little silver scrolls with the Hebrew etched into it, rolled up tight, and they were kept in a little necklace. And somebody was buried with this. And that would have been a way to ward off evil. And I discuss this in more detail in my book. But the thesis of my book is that the condemnation of divine images is not just saying God doesn't work like that. It's saying God doesn't work through these specific ones, but we're going to renegotiate how we think about divine images. So it's complex, but I don't think Jewish aniconism. I think Jewish aniconism plays a role because they didn't think of the text of the law as an icon. They used it as an icon, but they didn't think of it as an icon. Philip asks, I gather that part of the reason for the move towards monotheism, or at least monolatry, was Josiah's campaign of cult centralization, which makes intuitive sense as a way of consolidating power. Why didn't this happen with other ancient Mediterranean cultures, Greeks, Roman, Egyptians, with large pantheons? Seems like the sort of thing a Roman emperor would have been all over as a way of structuring imperial power. I think personally it's because they were too big. They were too pluriform, and they were just too big to be able to effectively consolidate power. Like the Roman, it would be phenomenally difficult for the Roman emperor to suddenly be like, hey man, we're not doing this anymore. Everything's gonna be in one. I think Josiah was operating with, like, conveniently, Josiah happened to be coming onto the scene when everything was coming into Jerusalem. And they were trying to fix that, and Josiah was like, pump the brakes, we're gonna stop and keep it this way. And so you have the convergence of this historical accident with this campaign of cult centralization. There was never a time when you could do that in ancient Greece or Rome, where all worship was coming into one cult site. They tried to do it in Egypt to some degree. Now, I don't think what Josiah did is monotheism. I'm presenting in a conference in May 6th and 7th, where I'm going to argue that there's no monotheism anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, and there's none in the New Testament either. And so what Akhenaten did was not monotheism, just like what Josiah did was not monotheism. But Akhenaten tried to consolidate everything and centralize the cult. And then as soon as he was dead, they went, okay, we're done with that. And they just went back to the old way. So I think Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, etc. We have an example of them trying to do it in Egypt, but again, they were just too big, and there were just too many other interests entangled with the cults to get away with it. But because Israel was small, because there was not a lot of social stratification, because of the accident of the de facto cult centralization affected by Sennacherib's invasion, Josiah hit the scene at the perfect time. And I think that was the single most effective and influential royal propaganda campaign that has ever existed. R asks, Dan, how much influence has the Gnostic ideas on John in the book of Revelation? Also, you helped me a lot to reconcile with my faith, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for the kind words, R. I appreciate it. I don't think there's a ton of Gnosticism really much at all in John and Revelation. I think in John you have some Platonic ideas, and Gnosticism is an outgrowth of Middle Platonism, but going in different directions. So I don't think there's much in the way of because John is not the main thing that the Gnostics did was reinterpret the Hebrew Bible's creation story as the story of this minor JV squad deity Yaltabaoth, who created his own little world so he could play emperor and trapped everybody in these fleshly bodies. And it's just an entirely different narrative that they construct. Shane, thank you so much for the question. Do you have recommendations for books that respond to Baucham's Christ and the Eyewitnesses on gospel authors? Fundamentalists like him a lot. Yes, they do. Christ and the Eyewitnesses, I think, came out a handful of years ago. I don't think anyone has 2008, that was a long time ago. I don't know that anybody has come out to write a book directly in response to that, but like he hasn't overturned the consensus view. When you go look at critical commentaries that have come out since then, people are like, yeah, Balcom said this, but nobody takes that seriously. So I don't think anybody feels the need to throw that much work at his book. Captain Deadpool laughs at my response. But yeah, I would recommend a critical commentaries, anything from the Hermeneus series on the gospel authors. I think most of them came out before Balcom, but like also the New Testament library, Culpeper just came out with a Matthew commentary. I think that's gonna have some great stuff in there. Let me just see when the other NTL volumes came out. You can look in Anchor Bible. There's going to be good stuff in there. International Critical Commentary is going to have some good stuff in there. So the Mark NTL commentary came out in 2006. Culpeper's came out in 2021. Thompson's NTL commentary on John came out in 2015. I don't see Luke in there. I may not have Luke, or Luke may not be out yet. But yeah, those commentaries are they'll talk about authorship and things like that. And the critical consensus is that these are not eyewitness accounts. But thank you for the question. Ian, thank you so much for the question. Hey, Dan, what's the difference between God in the Old versus New Testament? Also, have you had any discussions with Aslan Pahari or Aram Natsarang? Aram came, I hung out with him in Salt Lake City a couple years ago, 3 years ago. So I chat with him from time to time. I haven't spoken directly with Aslan. Difference between God in the Old Testament versus God in the New, not really much of a difference, apart from, I would say you have there's no one God of the Old Testament. There are many different representations of God, and they conflict with each other. You have, God is not a man that he would lie, in Numbers. And then in First Kings, in Jeremiah, in Genesis, I would argue, you have God lying. So they represent God in very different ways. And you have some violent representations of God in the Hebrew Bible, and you have merciful representations of God in the Hebrew Bible. You have violent representations of God in the New Testament. You have merciful representations of God in the New Testament. But in general, the different representations of God in the Hebrew Bible you can plot along a developmental trajectory as Judaism is grappling with the empires around it and with its own circumstances. In Greco-Roman period Judaism, you have a shift towards a more philosophical kind of approach. Christianity picks up the Greco-Roman period Jewish philosophical approach and runs with that football. Rabbinic Judaism flips a Yui and says, we're not interested in the Greek philosophy stuff. We're going to head back to the Hebrew Bible. And so Rabbinic Judaism kind of parts ways with Christianity running the Platonic football into the end zone. And so the New Testament is kind of Greco-Roman period Jewish conceptualizations of deity beginning to head in the direction of this Greek philosophical trajectory. And so diachronically, you're obviously going to have different ways of thinking about God and different representations. And so the New Testament representation comes well after the Hebrew Bible representation. And so the biggest differences are because of those two things, the diachronic distance, and then the fact that Christianity is picking up the Greco-Roman period Jewish conceptualization of deity and taking it in one direction, whereas Rabbinic Judaism goes back in another direction. Thank you for a great question. Star Wars fan asks, what do you think of Inspiring Philosophy's Exodus Rediscovered Thing and his historicity-based videos overall? Not great. I assume you don't like it, but why exactly? Because he does use a lot of citations and stuff. Yeah, and that is citation padding. And like I responded to one of his videos about how Luke, the census in Luke, is still historical, and like he dedicates a 40-minute YouTube video to arguing that Josephus was mistaken about when this census took place under Quirinius. And it's just, it doesn't need a 40-minute video. I mean, the case that he's making is just, hey, it's possible Josephus was mistaken. Let's just litter this video with details and citations and things to make it sound like they're all contributing to the strength of this conclusion. There is absolutely nothing anywhere in the 40-minute video that is a strong argument. It's just making the case, this is not impossible, this is plausible, and and the video just tries to make that case over and over and over again to give the illusion that it actually exceeds plausibility and becomes probability, and it never does. And then if you take that with his other video arguing against. Okay, I have daughters crying. Okay, hang on just a moment. Okay, sorry about that. There's some fighting going on out there. Okay, so I think I've responded to that question. And then we had the other question. Okay, yeah, inspiring philosophy stuff. And basically there are these 4 or 5 reasons to doubt Luke's census, and he goes through and basically argues for each of them. It's plausible that those reasons aren't convincing. And so basically it's 4 or 5 plausibilities stacked on top of each other, and the argument that Luke's census is historical requires all 4 or 5 of those be true. And the notion that you can take 4 or 5 plausibilities and conclude that therefore all 4 or 5 of them are probably true is not how these things work. The likelihood of, if you take all of these plausibilities, let's say they range from 20% likely to 50% likely, and that's being generous. If you take 4 or 5 things that are 20 to 50% likely, the likelihood that all of them are true is less than the least likely one of the 4 or 5. And so it's kind of a gish gallop. Okay. Hayden says, now you don't see monotheism in Josiah's reforms correctly, but how do you feel about scholarship that questions the real extent of Josiah's reforms? Is that something beyond our grasp, or can we truly know something of their extent in your view? I don't think Josiah's reforms are remarkably historical. I think the propaganda, the development of the book of Deuteronomy, I think the propaganda that came out of it and then was carried on for centuries afterward was the most effective and the clearest part of that. But yeah, I don't think the most of the reforms are historical. But I think Josiah wrote about them as if they were. Well, Josiah, the Deuteronomistic school, the people who followed after wrote about them as if they were, and rewrote the stories from before. Dan, do you recommend non-scholars go to SBL? Is it worth it? How's the experience and price? If you're interested in this kind of scholarship and if you can engage with the complexity and the technical language that you get exposed to, yeah, I think it's absolutely worth it. The price can be a little steep. However, if you don't go on the the trade floor. I forget what they call it. The book exhibit, basically. If you don't go on the book exhibit, you can get away without registering. But I enjoy it very much. I know people who are not scholars who go every year and enjoy it very much. But it is an awful lot. Attending papers and hearing people talk in very, very technical, very, very complex ways about very, very detailed minutia of research questions that nobody ever talks about in public might be a little much for folks who are not just committed to this kind of thing. Wayne asked, Dan, in 1 Samuel 28:13, can you explain the use of Elohim to describe the ghost of Samuel? What do you think is the best translation of that verse? Elohim means God, or deity, or gods. Yeah, I think there's a plural. What does it say? Okay, so I think there's a participle. I think the necromancer says, I see Elohim rising up from the underworld or from the earth. And the rising up is a plural participle, which could just be grammatical harmonization with the plural Elohim. Because Saul's response is, what is his form? What does he look like? And then the necromancer describes Samuel. And so it definitely means deity. I mean, there's nothing else it can mean, because Elohim means deity or deities or divine if it's being used adjectively. It's never used honorifically to refer to judges or anything like that. So, yeah, I think that's the best way to understand it. And I talk about that in my book, don't I? Pretty sure I talk about it in there. 1 Samuel 20. Yeah, I've got a couple of pages I talk about that. 41 and 42. What do I say? Blah, 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 blah. When Saul asks what she sees, the necromancer explains, I see deities, Elohim, rising up from the underworld. Saul states why he has come, and Samuel explains it on the following day, blah, 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 blah. The story thus appropriates a practice the authors viewed as marginalized or inappropriate in order to convey a prophecy concerning Saul's death, rhetorically illustrating Adonai's ultimate sovereignty over the dead and their access to prophetic knowledge. Not a ton of detail. If you want a great discussion of this chapter, I would recommend Esther Hamori's book. Let me pull it up. Women's Divination in Biblical Literature, Prophecy, Necromancy, and Other Arts of Knowledge. So Hamori wrote God's Monsters, which I think is phenomenal. I think everybody should read. But this is from the Anchor Yo Bible Reference Library. This is a more, slightly more technical book. But she dedicates a whole chapter to the necromancer of Ain Dor right here. And then goes through other equally fascinating discussions with Rebecca, Miriam, Deborah, Hannah, the wise women of 2 Samuel, Huldah, the prophetess who lived in the college. She's the one who interpreted the book of the law that Josiah found in the temple. So yeah, I would highly recommend checking out Esther's book there. Okay, how far behind have I fallen? Okay, Susu Studio, I assume. Somebody shared that I said IP is basically doing a Gish Gallop by filling up videos with all kinds of data. Kip Davis responds, better be careful. Going to make multiple hours-long live streams now. Well, okay. Thank you for the question, Studio. Is it possible to use the use of rocky ground in the parable of the sower was a subtle jab at followers of Peter, or that it was ever read that way? I don't think so. In fact, I don't know that the word that is used would line up with hang on, let me just pull it up real quick and see what the Greek uses, because it might not really say anything about okay. Sower went forth to sow. Matthew 13. Pathrovi. Rocky, stony. Yeah, that doesn't sound close enough to me to be to seem like it's evoking Peter. But if someone's made a case for that, I'd be interested in seeing it. Seth, thank you so much for the question. I'm sorry it took 24 minutes to get to it. I keep falling behind. Dr. McClellan, just wanted to send support. Thank you for speaking with my class at Eastern Tennessee State University this past weekend. My question, any comic book recommendations? I am really looking forward to, I said in a live stream a while ago, I have not purchased a hard copy of a comic book in over a decade. And then Ryan Otley reached out and sent me his whole compendium of Invincible and several other volumes that he's worked on, which was phenomenally generous. And so that's the only hard copy of a comic book that I've actually been reading through lately. However, I've always, ever since Spawn, I've been a big fan of Greg Capullo, who is now evidently doing some Marvel work, working on X-Men related stuff. And Wolverine is my favorite character. And so I don't know if any of his stuff with the X-Men is out yet, but I will be picking that up as soon as I become aware of where I can pick it up. So yeah, I guess I would recommend picking up Greg Capullo's work on the X-Men in whatever form it comes out. But thank you for the question and for the support. And I hope everybody enjoyed our little discussion. I certainly did. I thought there were some great questions, and I appreciated the opportunity to visit your virtually visit your campus. Trevor, thank you so much for the question. What do you know about the authors of the Gospels? Were these highly educated religious scholars who wrote it? Did each Gospel have multiple authors? John, I think, has multiple authors, because right at the very end it says, and this is the disciple who wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So who's we, and where is the line between what we wrote and what the beloved disciple wrote? And there are other indications that the narrative has been kind of edited. So I think at least John, we have multiple authors. I think the best discussion of what you're asking is Robin Faith Walsh's book, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament Within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. It's a bit technical, but the thesis is basically that the Gospels were not written by communities of Christians just trying to record the text. The Gospels were written by trained literary experts who were writing for a literary audience. And so it would have been highly educated religious scholars who wrote it according to Robin's thesis. Now, at the same time, you have to consider, hang on just a second, Candida Moss's new book. Hang on. Candida Moss's new book, God's Ghostwriters, Enslaved Christians and the Making of the Bible, where she argues that enslaved scribes were intimately involved in not just the copying, but the very composition of the text of the New Testament. And so these would have been trained enslaved folks. They would have been literarily sophisticated, but they still were enslaved to most likely elite, wealthy people. So I'd love to see Robin and Candida get together and discuss what they think's going on here. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. Thank you, Trevor. Hayden says, Dan, thank you for the Phil Collins reference. Is Another Day in Paradise better than Susudio, or are you a coward? Another Day in Paradise is better than Susudio. I am no coward. Silver asks, can you recommend further reading on the Bible's condemnations of same-sex activity not being a condemnation on homosexuality as a sexual orientation, as the concept of homosexuality as a sexual orientation didn't exist at the time? Yes, I can. Give me just a moment. I taught an online class on homosexuality in the Bible over a year ago. It's available at mcclellan.org if anybody wants to check out that online class. However, one of the class materials was a one-page bibliography. All of my online classes get a one-page bibliography. And so I'm happy to share that now. This should be big enough for you to see. Let me just make my page bigger and see if that's, yeah, that should be legible. And I've also put these, in fact, let me do something real quick. I've put all my bibliographies on a website. It's kind of a placeholder for the time being, but all my bibliographies are on this website. So I'm just going to throw this in the chat. Okay, I just posted a link to where all these bibliographies are if you would like to go directly to the bibliographies. But for the time being, these are the texts that I would recommend. The very first one at the top, Blondel, Ancient Sects, New Essays. I think that is very good. John Boswell's is more of this history of homosexuality in the church, I think, is really good. But Boswell, I think, goes a little beyond the data sometimes. Bruton's book, Love Between Women, Early Christian Responses to Female Homoeroticism, is phenomenal. Brownson's is interesting. Homosexuality and Civilization is good. The Oxford Handbook of New Testament Gender and Sexuality has a great article by Dunning, the editor, on homosexuality in the New Testament. Roman Sexualities right here is good for discussing that. Paul and Ancient Views of... No, actually, this one is a little more conservative. Companion to Greek and Roman Sexualities is good. Jennifer Knust's book, Unprotected Texts, is wonderful. Joseph Marshall's got wonderful books, Bodies on the Verge, Queering Pauline Epistles and Appalling Bodies. Homoeroticism in the Biblical World by Marty Nissanen, who usually does work on prophetic books. That's very good. So, and then Skinner, Sexuality in Greek and Roman Culture, is going to talk a lot about how they conceptualized sex. So, yeah, I would recommend many of those books. Okay, Alberto, thank you for the question. Is the application of 1 Corinthians 5:11 and 2 John 9-11 by Jehovah's Witness as basis for shunning the original intent behind those passages? Let me, I mean, shunning original intent is just a hermeneutic choice that usually comes down to making things relevant. Oh, shunning, basis for shunning. Okay. I think when it comes to 1 Corinthians 5, yeah, there is this idea of table fellowship, that they're saying don't share table fellowship with these folks. But the way that it is taken up by a lot of folks, I think, goes well beyond the mark. And shunning in the sense of, just cutting everything off and actually actively pushing people away or avoiding them, I think is just harmful. But thank you for that question. Dennis M., thanks for correcting misinformation on social media. Thank you so much for the kind words, Dennis. I appreciate it, and I will keep it up. Nate, thank you for the comment. Don't forget, bring the duck, but leave the dogma, which sounds an awful lot like The Godfather. Nate S. asks, Dan, which is harder to destroy, the X-Men or nonsense on TikTok? Definitely the nonsense on TikTok. Both seem impossible to kill. Yeah, I think one is going to last a lot longer. Let's see. Why in Luke 22:36, Jesus says the apostles have to sell their mantles to buy swords? Was Jesus prepared for auto defense, but decided to turn himself in so he can protect his followers when he saw it was impossible to win? Well, what we've got is this notion that this was to fulfill a prophecy that said he would be counted among the transgressors. And what a lot of people will point out is that it seems basically to be saying when Jesus is arrested, he needs to be arrested among people who are breaking the law. And so he's saying, hey, grab some swords. And they say, we got 2 swords right here. And he says, that's enough. So that this prophecy would basically be fulfilled, that when Jesus was captured, that he was among transgressors because they had those swords on them. But there are others who suggest that it is a warning about the coming tribulation when Rome attacks. That I think would be uncharacteristic of the gospel authors to say that. But the argument goes that Jesus is like, hey, there's going to come a time when you're going to have to defend yourselves. And they're like, hey, we got 2 swords right here. And Jesus is like, never mind. Fine. So that's the argument for that reading. Somebody just rang my doorbell and nobody is getting it. Hang on just a second. Oh, okay. Somebody's getting it. Star Wars fan, you should do full-length videos on your YouTube channel too, not just shorts. Maybe reacting to apologetic type videos would be cool. Yes, I have done a few. I did a few like a year ago. I need to do more. The production time is just so much greater for them that it is hard for me to fit it into my schedule. But I definitely, and particularly right now, because I've got 2 books I'm trying to finish. I've got a conference I've been organizing. I've got a lot of stuff going on right now. So, but yeah, my intention is to create more longer form stuff native to the YouTube environment. For fun, but only tangentially related biblical lore, the fish in Jonah changes genders at one point, and it's given way to both ancient rabbinic exegesis on this change as well as modern scholarship on transgender reading. Yes, it has. It is interesting. You have masculine form and you have a feminine form that are used. Another interesting thing is the reference to the plague of frogs in Egypt. It doesn't say that, it doesn't use the plural frogs. It just uses frog. And it's, most scholars say this is kind of like the word deer. It can be used to refer collectively, but there were some Jewish traditions that arose about one gigantic frog that plagued Egypt. So fun stuff. Simone Bat Yochai says, I'm writing on Jeremiah currently, so apologies if this question is too broad, but do you think there's a significant relationship between certain oracles in Jeremiah and the priestly literature? The specific case I'm thinking of is the first 2 oracles in chapter 21 being similar to Leviticus 26, as well as the widely recognized Deuteronomic influences, though a chunk of that's redactional. Does this have significant implications for the historical modeling of the Pentateuchal documents? I would have to look at that to be able to have anything intelligent to say about that. I would have to take some time to look at all of those. I am not familiar with that specific question. I am aware of some of the different influences in Jeremiah, but I'm not aware of that specific question. But yeah, that is If that's what you're writing on, good luck. Sometimes having to wrestle with complex and nuanced questions can sometimes be a difficult part of writing. Plague of Frog. I know you're keen on early American history. Do you have a favorite founding father or one that's the least problematic? That's a great question. Least problematic? I don't know that I have one that they're all problematic in different ways. I've read some great stuff. I think Madison was a fascinating character, not without issues, but just a fascinating character. I thought Washington was fascinating. I think he wanted to develop a legacy, and so he was able to subordinate his own ego and his own ambitions to his legacy, and that was why he was able to take the presidency and then after 2 terms say, I'm stepping down. And I think he didn't like being president either. But yeah, those kinds of people who are just so committed to personal growth, like trying to become a better character. I think he did it primarily for his legacy than just for the sake of being a better person. But he fascinates me in a lot of ways. Hamilton is probably one of the more problematic in a lot of ways, but just a prodigy. Yeah, there are a bunch of them, but The Second Creation is a book about the Constitution that I really, really enjoyed. What's up?
Can I use your iPad?
Yeah, go ahead.
Get up. Okay, good.
Okay, let me get back to the discussion. When I have to go back and forth between the Discord and the super chats, I don't get to Thomas Paine. Yeah, Thomas Paine's a good one. Fascinating deist. I think Thomas Jefferson was another fascinating deist. When people appeal to the Declaration and they're like, see, it talks about God. This is Christian nationalism. It's like, you didn't read any of what Thomas Jefferson said about Christianity. You don't know what you're talking about. Thoughts on Shaddai being used a group of wilderness deities within Canaanite pantheon? I think you have the Deir Allah inscription, the Shaddain, the Aramaic plural. You have in Deuteronomy 32, I think it's 17, you have Shadim, which is the masculine plural, the Hebrew masculine plural, which I think is probably a reference to these deities. El Shaddai is a title, God of the wilderness, maybe God of breasts, God of the mountains. We don't know for sure, but probably one of the best discussions. Ted Lewis's very large book, The Origin and Character of God, discusses El Shaddai at some length. So here on page 101, we have the main El Shaddai section. Subsections: El Shaddai is the God of the mountain. El Shaddai is the God of the steppe lands. El Shaddai is the destroyer. El Shaddai, early or late. So yeah, there's lots of good discussion in there if you're interested in scholarship on that. Muiz Adam, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Thank you so much for the question. Hey, Dan, sorry for the vague question, but where can I find a repository for the extremely analytic and logical angels fit on a pin type arguments? Ooh, I don't know that there is a good place where all of them are consolidated and then are discussed. Yeah, I think you have to. I don't know of anything that consolidates all those discussions, just because they are so complex and nuanced, and there are so many different treatments of them. I can't think of anything like that. But usually critical commentaries they won't bring up angels on the fitting on the head of a pin, excuse me, questions, but sometimes they will refer to theological questions that come up. Yeah, the best I can come up with is commentaries. We'll sometimes talk about that stuff if some of those arguments are like directly linked to specific passages in certain biblical books. But yeah, other than that, all I would say is sometimes like philosophy of religion, like websites or groups or things like that might have discussions about those things. But yeah, that's one that I don't know that there's a great answer to that. Highly related to the question about American history, Quaker Benjamin Lay, friend with the Franklins, would kidnap slavers' kids to show them what it would be like to sell slaves' kids down the river. Showed up at Quaker meetings and flicked fake blood out of a Bible on people while calling them hypocrites. Yeah, if I recall, he was was he a little person? He's famous among the Quakers as somebody who was bit by the abolitionist bug and just went whole hog. He was hunchbacked, huh? Yeah, because I remember there were physical things about him that made people. Is why he stuck out. Like articles would refer to him like that. He was like 4'10". Okay. Dan McClellan, which theory of atonement do you think has most basis in NT verses? I think there are a lot of different theories. I think even within Paul, you have different models. So I don't think there's anyone that stands out. Yeah, but I think the substitutionary one has been getting a lot of headlines today. Is one of the more problematic ones. I know it's just the perspective, but that hydro flask looks comically massive. It's not gigantic, but thermo flask. Got it at Costco. You have to love the Quakers. My grandmother is a Quaker. The first wedding I ever went to was a Quaker wedding, and it was odd. I was not ready for like 30 minutes of silence, but when it comes to holy envy, Quakers are definitely up there. There are many ways in which I think the Quakers are streets ahead. if you get that reference. Do any other deities align with Adonai? Baal is another storm deity that aligns with Adonai. Robert Miller II, in this book, Adonai, Origin of a Desert God, argues that Adonai originates as a sky and mountain deity, which is you have other deities that are somewhat like that. A little less Baal, especially a little less Marduk, and the further away one gets, the less the storm deities resemble Adonai. A little less Marduk. I just thought of what is it? A little bit Alexis, a little bit Marduk. Okay. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, used to say quite often he'd like to come back as a Quaker in his next life. That's cute. Callan M, thank you so much for the question. Dr. Yu, Kip, Bowen, Bird, etc. do so much good. Well, thank you so much for the kind words. We try. We have something that we do called Diablo Critics. We have a live stream that we get together and do one Sunday every month. I don't know what we're talking about this coming episode, but we try to respond to whatever, whatever controversies are going on out there usually in the world of apologetics. Whatever has been capturing people's attention. John Geyer, thank you for the question. Are there any good books on how the stories of Hebrew Bible were demythologized? I can't think of anything off the top of my head. That would be interesting. I don't think I know about anybody who's looked specifically at at demythologizing, naturalizing the story of the Hebrew Bible. Yeah, that's a good one. I don't have a good answer for that, but I will definitely have to look into that, so I don't get caught off guard again. Okay, got a note. Dan Wayne asks, Dan, do you think Candida Moss's work on authorship is going to change the synoptic problem in scholarship? How do you think it impacts different solutions to the problem? I am not. I don't know that I have anything intelligent to say about that. We did I did a live stream with Candida the other day, and somebody asked us, in fact, Wayne, you may have been the one who asked the question of Candida, and I forget what she said. I know she kind of, I feel like she kind of deflected the question, which is what I'm going to end up having to do. But I think somebody just finished their dissertation, and they were under, oh, why can't I think of his name? He's a good friend. Goodacre, Mark Goodacre. I think Mark Goodacre just supervised a dissertation on the synoptic problem, and I've heard good things about the dissertation. So I think that it will have to be incorporated somehow, but it is also her book is more of a trade volume. So yeah, I don't know. And any guess that I'm going to have is probably not going to be incredibly helpful. Okay, and we got, my family is starting to get a little antsy about dinner. So I think I'm going to go in about 8 minutes. I'm going to have to go start dinner. Sebastian Elder, thank you so much for the questions. You sometimes mention Ugaritic literature when talking about the formation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Can you expand on what Ugaritic literature is and how it informs the Hebrew Scriptures? Absolutely. So Ugarit was a Bronze Age city that was near the coast in Syria. And they used an alphabetic script that was cuneiform. So it's a cuneiform alphabetic script. And it was destroyed in the Bronze Age collapse somewhere around 1200 BCE. And scholars knew that there was some city called Ugarit, and I think they maybe had discovered something or other reference to Ugarit. But in 1929, a farmer in Syria uncovered a sarcophagus, and a bunch of French archaeologists descended upon this place and uncovered this massive Bronze Age city, and like over 1,000 texts written in this mysterious alphabetic cuneiform language that they assumed it was Northwest Semitic, and so it was not incredibly difficult to decipher. And it is a Northwest Semitic language very closely related to Hebrew, and so it helps us reconstruct Northwest Semitic prior to the development of Hebrew. and it helps us contextualize the development of Hebrew. But also there are a bunch of ritual and mythological texts that mention a lot of the deities that are mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, and helps fill out our understanding of the Northwest Semitic pantheon. And so the parallels between the Ugaritic literature and the Hebrew Bible indicate that they're both kind of drawing from the same sociocultural matrix. And so kind of like the frog DNA in Jurassic Park, we can sometimes use the Ugaritic text to kind of fill in some of the gaps if we're doing it very, very carefully. But there are a lot of interesting overlaps. And one thing I point out a lot is that Isaiah 27:1, this where it talks about in that day, Adonai will, with his terrible, sharp, strong sword, punish Leviathan, the wriggling serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, the dragon that lives in the sea. And so from 400 to 500 years earlier, we have this Ugaritic text that says, Baal defeated Leton, the wriggling serpent, the twisting serpent, the dragon with 7 heads. And so Leton is the Ugaritic cognate to the Hebrew Leviathan. And so obviously the Leviathan tradition reflects a broader Northwest Semitic tradition about a chaos monster who does battle with the storm deity. And so the author of Isaiah is borrowing, if not quoting, at least borrowing this tradition that existed hundreds of years earlier. So the Ugaritic literature helps us better understand the development of Hebrew. It helps us better interpret some of what's going on in the Hebrew Bible, and it gives us some context and some backdrop to understanding why they talk about the gods the way they do and how they may have organized their understanding of the pantheon. Another way it's relevant is that Deuteronomy 32:8-9, where we have the statement that the Most High divided up the nations according to the number of the Bnei Elohim, the children of God, and Adonai's portion was his people. Jacob was his share of the inheritance. The notion of Bnei Elohim, the children of God, is found multiple times in the Ugaritic literature. The notion of this authoritative high deity is found in the Ugaritic literature. Our knowledge of the divine council and all that is helpfully a lot of the gaps can be filled in with the Ugaritic literature. So it's just immensely helpful in numerous different ways. But that's a great question. And thank you for the excuse to ramble about Ugarit for a little bit. Thoughts on Star Wars fan ask, thoughts on people who think Moses was given the Torah by God, but he didn't write it, someone later did. Oh, that like what we have as the Torah was recorded by someone after Moses, but that Moses was given a form of it. I don't know people who think that, but that if that may be a way to account for the fact that some of the literature we have, particularly the Deuteronomistic literature, tells these stories about things that went on in Moses' day or in Joshua's day, and then says and then says cough cough, and then says, and that thing is still there to this very day, which suggests that whoever's writing this is writing from a much later time period. So how does that work? So that may be a way to account for that, but I don't think there is good evidence for that. The notion that the Pentateuch is a unified composition, the work of a single person, is not supported by any data. I read a volume of selected translations from the Ugaritic text, stories from ancient Canaan. It's like reading the weird cousin of the Hebrew Bible. Yeah, try translating that stuff. I fall down at the feet of the king 7 times, even 8 times I fall down, just over and over again. It is, it's interesting stuff. Stories from ancient Canaan. I'm trying to think. That's not a Mark Smith. Yeah, that's a Coogan and Smith book. So that is this book here. That's from 2012. Other things that you can look up if you want to read some of the Ugaritic literature. Probably one of the better things is Nicholas Wyatt's book, Religious Texts from Ugarit. Nicholas Wyatt was one of the readers for my dissertation, but he's, and that's Baal there on the front, holding a lightning bolt and holding a mace in the smiting pose. And those are the waters beneath his feet. And then you can also see he's got horns coming out of his helmet. So the horns representing his deity. Another one you can look at is Parker. Is that, no, that's the wrong thing. That's not what I wanted. There we go. Ugaritic Narrative Poetry by Simon Parker. Translated by Mark Smith, Simon Parker, Edward Greenstein, Ted Lewis, and David Marcus. Society of Biblical Literature book from, that's from the 90s, 97. But you've got the Kirta epic, the Akkad, Baal, and then a bunch of shorter texts. Whereas the Birth of the Gracious Gods is the fun one. That's where El is out walking along the beach and sees two ladies and his yad, which is a euphemism, grows as large as the sea. And he impregnates the two ladies, and they give birth to the gracious gods. If I recall, dawn and dusk are the deities that they give birth to. Fun for the whole family. Okay, it is 5:30. 97 was a very good year. 97 was a good year. That was the year before I was a junior. Oh man, crazy year. Yeah, somebody's asking where these comments are coming from. So I have a Discord that's associated with my Patreon. So patreon.com/MAKLELAN. Anyone who is a subscriber on there gets access to the Discord. And during live streams, there's a live stream channel on my Discord, and questions there get priority. So if you do a super chat question or something like that, and then I'm responding to other questions over here, it's because I'm giving priority to the Discord questions, just so you're aware. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. Thank you so much for some wonderful questions tonight, and for your support. As usual, I hope you have people around you who love you. I hope you have a safe place to stay, and I hope you have enough food on the table. And I will see you all next time I do a live stream. Have a wonderful weekend. And if you are celebrating tomorrow, I hope you have a wonderful Easter.